The gang leader collapsed into his henchman's arms, gasping for air, his face a mask of shock and pain. His eyes were wide, struggling to process what had just happened. Around them, the entire prison cafeteria fell silent. 200 inmates watched in disbelief. Mike Tyson had tried to walk away twice. He had remained calm, controlled his anger, and given every chance for the situation to end peacefully. But 2 minutes earlier, that same gang leader had made the biggest mistake of his prison career. He had threatened Mike Tyson and refused to let him leave. Now, to understand how a routine lunch in a prison cafeteria turned into the moment that changed the entire power structure of the unit, and why Mike had no choice but to react, we need to go back to the beginning of that afternoon. It was early 1993, a few months into Mike Tyson's sentence. Mike was 26 years old and serving time in a correctional institution in Indiana. By this point, he had established a routine: keep his head down, do his time, and avoid the politics and drama that consumed so many inmates. He wasn't looking for respect or trying to build a reputation. He just wanted to survive his sentence and get out. But in prison, sometimes trouble finds you, whether you're looking for it or not. Tension in the cafeteria. The prison cafeteria was one of the few places where the entire inmate population mixed: maximum security, medium security, and all the different cell blocks. At mealtimes, everyone was in the same space. It was loud, chaotic, and always tense, with the constant potential for violence. Guards watched from elevated positions around the perimeter, ready to intervene if things got out of control, but they generally let the inmates manage their own hierarchies as long as there was no bloodshed. Mike had learned to navigate cafeteria politics carefully. He ate at a table with a few other inmates who stayed out of trouble. Guys quietly doing their time, just like him. No gang affiliations, no drama, just men trying to get through each day. That afternoon, Mike went through the lunch line as usual. The food was institutional: some kind of meat, mashed potatoes, vegetables boiled until they lost their color, a piece of bread, and a small carton of milk. He took his tray and headed to his usual table. That's when he noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Conversations were getting quieter. Inmates were looking toward the entrance where a group of men had just walked in. 6 of them moving together with the kind of confidence that comes from running the place. In the center of the group was a man everyone in the unit knew: Tony Marchetti. Tony was 42, a lifer, serving time for multiple charges of extortion and assault. He had been in the system for over a decade, and in that time, he had built an empire within the prison walls. He controlled the contraband trade, managed protection rackets, settled disputes, and basically functioned as the unofficial authority of the unit. Even the guards dealt with him with caution because Tony maintained order, and order made their jobs easier. Tony was a big man, perhaps 6'2", and 240 lbs, with a kind of bulk that came from years of prison weightlifting. His arms were covered in tattoos that told the story of his criminal career, and his face had the hard, weathered look of someone who had lived in violence his entire life. The confrontation. Mike had seen Tony around, but they had never interacted directly. He had heard the stories, though, about inmates who crossed Tony and ended up in the infirmary, and about the network of loyalty and fear Tony had built. Mike had made a conscious decision to stay off Tony's radar, to be just another inmate during his time there. But that was about to change. Mike sat at his usual table with his tray, nodding to the 2 other guys already there. He was about to start eating when he felt the energy in the cafeteria shift again. Conversations stopped. Movement slowed. Everyone was watching something. Mike looked up and saw Tony, and 3 of his henchmen walking directly toward his table. Mike's table wasn't in Tony's usual section. This was intentional and deliberate. Tony was coming specifically to speak to Mike, and everyone in that room knew what that meant. Tony stopped about 3 feet from Mike's table, with his group fanning out behind him. The 2 other inmates at Mike's table stood up immediately and walked away without a word, leaving Mike sitting alone. "Tyson," Tony said, his voice heavy with authority. "We need to talk." Mike looked up calmly, his expression neutral. "About what?" "About how things work in here," Tony said. "See, I've been watching you. You've been here a few months, staying quiet, minding your business. That's smart. But the thing is, everyone in this unit either works with me or works for me. Those are the only 2 options." Mike slowly put down his fork. "I'm not looking to work with anyone. I'm just doing my time." Tony smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "That's not how it works. You're Mike Tyson. You have a name. You have the respect of these guys. That makes you valuable. So you can use that value to help my operation, or you can become a problem that needs to be solved. The choice is yours." The cafeteria was in absolute silence now. Every inmate watched, waiting to see how it would end. The guards noticed the gathering and were paying close attention, hands near their radios. Mike took a deep breath, looked Tony in the eye, and said simply, "I don't work for anyone." Tony's smile vanished. "You don't understand. I run this place. Everything that happens here happens because I allow it. You think you can just ignore that?" Mike's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it. "Not anymore." The words hung in the air like a bomb. Tony's face went from pale to bright red in about 2 seconds. His gang members looked at each other in shock, unable to believe someone had just said that to their boss. Around the cafeteria, inmates were paralyzed, knowing they were witnessing something significant. Tony's jaw clenched. He looked at all the watching faces and yelled, "What are you all looking at? Mind your own business." Heads turned away quickly, but everyone continued listening, aware that something big was happening. The breaking point. Tony turned back to Mike, his voice lower now, but simmering with rage. "What did you just say to me?" "You heard me," Mike said calmly, returning to his food as if the conversation were already over. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Tony took a step toward the table. "You think because you were someone on the outside, you're special in here. You think your boxing career means anything behind these walls?" Mike looked at him. "I am Mike Tyson, and I don't take orders from anyone, especially someone who needs to threaten people to feel powerful." Tony's face was crimson now, veins visible in his neck. His group was tense, waiting for the signal to act. The guards were closing in, sensing violence was imminent. Mike picked up his tray, preparing to leave. He had said his piece and made his position clear. There was no point in prolonging it. But Tony wasn't finished. As Mike stood up with his tray, Tony suddenly swung his arm and slapped it with force, sending it flying. Mike's food scattered across the floor, potatoes, meat, and vegetables forming a mess at his feet. The cafeteria gasped collectively. That was a direct physical provocation. In prison politics, that was a declaration of war. Mike looked at the food on the floor and then slowly raised his eyes to Tony. His expression was calm, but his eyes had changed. Anyone who knew boxing, who had watched Mike Tyson fight, would recognize that look. It was the look he had right before he ended someone. "That was a mistake," Mike said quietly. Tony laughed, looking to his group for support. They laughed too, but the sound was nervous. "What are you going to do about it, Tyson? Cry? Tell the guards?" Mike took a deep breath, visibly controlling himself. "I'm going to get another tray." He stepped past Tony toward the lunch line, and for a moment it seemed like the situation might de-escalate. Mike had chosen not to fight. He had chosen to walk away. But Tony couldn't let it go. He couldn't let Mike have the last word. He couldn't allow the other inmates to see someone challenge him and walk away unscathed. His entire authority was based on fear and dominance, and if Mike got away with disrespecting him, that authority would crumble. As Mike picked up a new tray and headed back to his table, Tony blocked his path directly. Before Mike could react, Tony shoved him hard in the shoulder. "You're not going anywhere," Tony said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "Not until you understand that I own this place, and that means I own you." 2 seconds. Mike stopped. The tray in his hands was steady, but every muscle in his body had tensed. The entire cafeteria held its breath. Mike turned to face Tony fully. "Last chance. Get out of my way." Tony shoved him again, harder this time. "Make me." What happened next took perhaps 2 seconds, but everyone who witnessed it would remember it for the rest of their lives. Mike set his tray on the nearest table. His movements were deliberate and controlled. Then he turned back to Tony, and his hands came up. Not in a clumsy street brawl style, but in the technical stance of a professional boxer. Tony saw it and tried to throw a punch, a long right cross that had probably worked in bar fights and prison clashes. Mike slipped it easily, barely moving his head, and then countered. The first punch was a short, devastating body blow to Tony's solar plexus. It was precise and technical, delivered with decades of training behind it. The air exploded out of Tony's lungs with an audible gasp. Before Tony could process that pain, the second punch came. A compact hook to the chin, perfectly placed, using Tony's own momentum against him. 2 punches, 2 seconds, both so fast that some inmates would later argue whether there had been 1 strike or 2. Tony's eyes rolled back slightly. His knees gave way. He collapsed backward into the arms of his henchman, who barely caught him before he hit the ground. He was conscious but completely stunned, unable to breathe, unable to speak, only making gasping sounds as his brain tried to process what had happened. The cafeteria was paralyzed in absolute silence. 200 men, guards, all just staring in disbelief. Then from somewhere in the back of the room, an inmate began to clap. Slow, deliberate applause. Another joined in, then another. Within seconds, half the cafeteria was cheering, a mixture of respect and relief. Tony had ruled through fear and intimidation, and Mike had just shown everyone that the Emperor had no clothes. The aftermath, Mike picked up his new tray and walked calmly back to his table. He sat down and began to eat as if nothing had happened. Tony's group was trying to help him up, but he was still struggling to breathe, processing the shock and humiliation of what had just occurred. Guards rushed in, radios crackling, trying to figure out what happened. "He started it," one inmate shouted. "Tony shoved him twice," added another. "Tyson just defended himself." Multiple witnesses corroborated the same story. Tony had been the aggressor, had thrown Mike's food on the floor, and had physically shoved Mike twice. Mike had only responded after repeated provocations, and even then, with minimal force, just enough to stop the threat. The guards took statements and separated the parties involved, but in the end, no serious consequences fell on Mike. It was a clear case of self-defense, and honestly, the guards weren't unhappy to see Tony put in his place. He had been a thorn in their side for years. Tony spent the next few days in the infirmary being monitored. Physically, he was bruised but not severely injured. Mike had shown remarkable restraint for someone with his skill. But Tony's reputation, his authority, and his control over the unit were destroyed beyond repair. In the days and weeks that followed, Tony's network fell apart. Inmates who were loyal out of fear began to refuse his orders. Rival groups moved in on territories he controlled. Within a month, Tony was requesting protective custody, afraid of the very people he had once dominated. The legacy of respect, Mike, for his part, gained respect throughout the unit without seeking it. Inmates who feared Tony now felt safer. The cafeteria became less tense. Even the guards noticed the difference. An inmate who had been at Mike's usual table before Tony arrived approached him a few days later. "Man, everyone is talking about what happened. You're a legend here now." Mike shook his head. "I didn't want any of that. I just wanted to eat my lunch in peace." "But you stood up to him. No one has done that in years. You changed this whole place." Mike was silent for a moment and then said, "Sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes people push you until you have to push back. I tried to walk away. I tried to de-escalate, but he wouldn't let it go." The inmate nodded. "For what it's worth, thank you. Life's going to be easier around here now that Tony doesn't run everything." Mike would later reflect that the incident taught him something important about power and respect. True power isn't about bullying people or making them afraid of you, he would say. It's about knowing when to use your strength and when to hold back. Tony ruled by fear, and fear only lasts until someone stops being afraid. Respect, real respect, is earned differently. The story of what happened in that cafeteria spread throughout the prison system. Other units heard about it. Tony's reputation was permanently damaged, not just in one prison but across the network. He had been exposed as someone who couldn't back up his threats when faced with real opposition. Mike served the rest of his sentence with relatively few problems. Inmates gave him space, but also respect. He was no longer a target because everyone saw what happened to the last person who tried to make him one. But the real story wasn't about the violence. It was about patience, restraint, and acting only when no other option remains. Mike had tried to avoid the confrontation. He had used words first. He had tried to walk away. He had given multiple chances for de-escalation, and only when physically attacked repeatedly did he finally respond, and even then, with controlled, minimal force, rather than the devastating power he was capable of unleashing. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is walk away. But sometimes, when walking away is no longer an option, the strongest thing you can do is stand your ground and show someone that their intimidation tactics don't work on everyone. Mike Tyson showed a prison full of inmates that you don't have to accept being bullied, even by someone who seemingly controls everything. And sometimes 2 seconds is all it takes to change everything.